Bob Hayes grew up on the grimy streets of Jacksonville. His father ran a shoe shop in the ghetto. Every street criminal hung around that shop. Hayes' father's best friend, Josh Baker, was a numbers runner. When Baker wasn't running numbers, he used Hayes to organize races. All of the criminals in the neighborhood would bet on the races. Baker made a lot of money off of a young Hayes. Hayes' running style was awful. He had a pigeon-toed stride, often spiking one leg with the other foot while running, and he surged heavily from side to side instead of running straight forward. No way was he going to win, those who were betting against Hayes would say, but each time they would lose. Hayes won every race. In the 7th grade, a trash-talking 12th grader came to the shop and challenged Hayes. He was some big shot around the neighborhood, some fast teenager with a reputation. When he found out how young Hayes was, he laughed. He couldn't believe that this was the one beating everyone. Well, Hayes smoked him too. Baker won a lot of money off of Hayes that day. Hayes learned how to run at an early age by racing his friends on the dirt backstreet roads of Jacksonville. In the 7th and 8th grade, he entered his first 50, 100, and 200-yard dash. He also competed in the 400 and 880-yard relays. He competed in the high jump, long jump, and the pole vault. Guess how many he won? He won every one of these events. Every single one of them. As a kid, Hayes was confident in his speed. He would challenge everyone who had a reputation of being fast. He raced people for one single reason: bragging rights. When Hayes' junior year came at Matthew Gilbert High School, Hayes had his eyes on a sprinter who was the fastest track runner at his school, so he challenged him. Hayes really didn't want to run track. That was the last thing he wanted to do. What he wanted was bragging rights. The only way for him to get bragging rights was for him to be the best. Everyone laughed at the fact that he was going to race the top sprinter in school in street clothes and in shoes. But what they were unaware of, bullets don't need shoes. Hayes beat the best sprinter in school by 5 yards, leaving him in the dirt.
We had to run in the park on grass. I was a little cocky and had not lost a race in a while. So when we did start, he won.
After that, the track coach recruited him for the team. Hayes dominated everyone after that at Matthew Gilbert. No one could touch him. His only competition was New Stanton High School's own Alfred Denson, the fastest player in Jacksonville at the time. Denson had been running track since he was in the 6th grade. No one beat him. It was now in 11th grade. He won every race he ever had. At that time, he ran a 9.9, which was a Jacksonville record. Denson was like a GOAT in track in Jacksonville. People would just line up and race Denson with already knowing in their heart that they was going to lose the race. Hayes, on the other hand, had to face an experienced Denson who had been running for years. They had to race on a grass track because the city didn't have any cinder tracks for blacks. This was the talk of Matthew Gilbert. Only Gilbert knew what Hayes could do, but New Stanton never heard of Hayes. To Denson, this was just another race, another one of his victims. However, to Bob Hayes, this was another victim for bragging rights, another victim to add to his collection. It was a bright and sunny day. Hayes' coach kept reminding him about his get-off. Hayes was infamously known for his bad start, and this was no different. He started the race off behind Denson. Denson got a good lead on Hayes, but that is when Sonic the Hedgehog kicked in. Hayes turned on the jets and eventually was even with Denson around the 60-yard mark. Hayes ended up pulling off one of the greatest upsets in Jacksonville high school history. Hayes was the talk of the town. No one could believe it. Hayes' victory lap wouldn't last long though. The next time they raced, Hayes had another bad start, and Denson beat Hayes by a snub. Hayes ran a 9.6 and Denson ran a 9.7. Some say Hayes was robbed that day. But what this loss did was turn Hayes into a menace. He worked on his get-off, and when they met up again, Hayes took it personally. He smoked Denson by 7 yards, clocked in at 9.6. But according to Hayes' coaches, they clocked him in at 9.4 seconds, which was 1/10 of a second off the world record at 16 years old. They never reported it because they were afraid of the backlash. Certain white folks would have claimed that the time was made up and that Hayes' coaches were trying to cheat, so they kept quiet. Hayes had 7 events that day: the 100, 220, 440, and 880 yards, sprint relay, high jump, and long jump. He dominated each event and won them all. Bob Hayes was an extraordinary athlete in high school. He had 4 scholarships for basketball, most notably South Carolina. The Los Angeles Angels wanted to sign Hayes in baseball, but it was football where he received his most scholarship offers. Offers from Nebraska, Oklahoma, USC, UCLA, and Penn State. Hayes had offers all over the country. Hayes eventually chose the hometown favorite, Florida A&M, to play for the legendary Jake Gaither.
I had a group of boys who wanted to win, who wanted to excel. They were willing to pay the price.
1960 marked the beginning of a golden age.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge.
The smell of revolution was in the air. Bob Hayes, only 17 years old, went off to college with a world of possibilities ahead of him. His college roommates included Charles Sutton and Benny Thomas, and they all resided in Gibbs Hall dorm. At that time, Florida was segregated, especially Tallahassee. Black college students all over the city had protests and rallies that oftentimes ended in violence.
In the afternoon, violence erupted at St. Augustine Beach as a group of whites attacked about 75 integrationists during a wait-in demonstration.
Rednecks oftentimes came to Florida A&M practices just to call Hayes and his other black teammates racist names. A few months after Hayes arrived in Florida, he was wrongly convicted of a robbery, an incident he called was racially influenced. Hayes was placed on probation for 4 years. His arrest made the headlines of the Miami Herald. Hayes joined the track team in 1960. In Hayes' first time trials in the 100 yards, the bullet didn't quite leave the chamber. He ended up third place. But Hayes was a competitive beast. He got into track shape and beat everybody at his school. That was the last time anyone ever beat him at Florida A&M. When Hayes came to Florida A&M, the fastest person on campus was Eugene White. White was 2 years ahead of Hayes. He won the SLAC championship in the 100 yards the spring before. The competitive Hayes challenged White in a race during wind sprints at football practice. Hayes dominated White and beat him so bad that the best sprinter at Florida A&M ended up quitting the track team. On March 1961, Hayes ran his first track race. It was the 100-yard dash at Florida A&M Relays. He was spectacular. He tied the record for the fastest freshman time in college history, the same record Jesse Owens set in his freshman year in 1934 at Ohio State University.
Well, my biggest thrill was when I won the 100-meter dash, and the American flag went up and they were playing the Star-Spangled Banner.
A few weeks later, Hayes had another tremendous race in Tuskegee on what Hayes called a dirt track center field. The field was more dirt than it was a field, yet Hayes ran a blistering 9.5. Hayes was in his groove. Later that day, on a wet track in the 220, he ran the fastest time in the world in 1961. Hayes had a blazing 20.1 time. The time was only 1/10 of a second slower than the world record at the time. It was a record for a freshman. Hayes was quickly becoming a buzz in the track and field world. Hayes' freshman dominance wasn't finished. Hayes and his coach Pete Griffin traveled by flight to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in the championships of the National Collegiate of Athletic Association.
Track spectacle in the U.S. since the 1932 Olympics,
where he tied the world set in 1948 with a clocking on 9.3 seconds in a qualifying heat.
And in the men's 100-meter dash, Bob Hayes equals the meet record set in 1958. When Mr. Hayes gets going, the X-15 couldn't catch him.
This was the race that gave Hayes the confidence that he might have been fast enough to compete at the 1964 Olympics. Hayes was named by the Track and Field News article as the champion freshman athlete of the year. Hayes, who didn't want to run track a few weeks before, was now in a position to become a U.S. Olympian phenom. Hayes was a highly competitive beast. In 1962, Hayes was invited to run the 60 in front of a sold-out 15,000 audience. The games were inside of Madison Square Garden for the AAU Indoor Championship. Before the race, Hayes was walking on the tracks with Jesse Owens when a young man wearing huge glasses walked up to Hayes and boasted, "I'm Charlie Green of the University of Nebraska. If you do happen to win tonight, you're going to have to break the world record, my world record." Green ran a record 6-point flats in the 60 sometime back, but that was a big mistake. Immediately, Hayes saw Green as another one of his bragging collections that he could add to his trophy case. You gotta understand, this is what Hayes did. He's been adding so-called speedsters to his trophy case for years. Well, Hayes did break the record. He became the first person to ever run the 60 below 6.0. He beat Green by an entire 2 feet. Green learned that day that talking trash to Bob Hayes was a huge mistake. In 1962, Hayes set milestones that would change an entire generation.
For the past 30 years, many Americans have been congratulating themselves on the integrating force of athletics, where white and black compete side by side.
Before the 60s, Florida track and field was segregated. Major universities didn't look at college track runners of color as true track runners, especially at the Florida's athletic club's invitational events. Well, that changed when Hayes competed in the first ever black versus white school in the state of Florida. So this was a race with high stakes involved. Hayes didn't disappoint. Although the time wasn't official because of a minor technical issue, he ran a blistering 9.2 seconds and put Florida A&M on the map. In his next couple of races, Hayes was outstanding. He anchored relay racers and won them all. He once ran an 8.9 in the 100-yard dash. But again, the time wasn't certified. According to the voters, it was impossible to run that fast, so they eventually rounded off his 8.9 time to 9.3 seconds. Hayes was selected to represent the country in a dual meeting in Poland and in Russia. Hayes' team beat Poland by 131 to 81 points. 1963, Bob Hayes was just entering into super mode speed. He was in Sonic mode. This mode would last from 1963 to 1964. His first race in 1963 was on February 3rd on a grass track at the AAU Southern Games. He ran a blazing 20.5 in the 200 meters. That time was the world record. If that was fast, then a 6.9 in the 70 yards indoors was Sonic the Hedgehog type speed. On February 16th, 1963, Hayes broke the world record set back in 1926, but he wasn't finished. In San Antonio Relays, Walnuts, California, he ran a 9.9 in 100 meters.
There, star sprinter Frank Budd pulls a muscle, forcing him out. It could end his career. Bob Hayes wins the 100.
Which was the fastest in history. Unfortunately, it was disallowed because of a tailwind speed. In 1 year, Track and Field News went from naming him the most valuable track runner to potentially being at some point in the future the greatest track runner in history, and he was just in college. If we backtrack to 1962, Hayes ran a 9.2 in the 100-yard dash, but it was called back because of technical issues. That would have been his fastest time. In 1963, Hayes had another shot. This time, he wanted to break the record without leaving any doubt. The only issue, he was facing John Gilbert. Gilbert was a fine runner out of the Southern California Striders. Again, Hayes had issues with the get-off. He stumbled, but turned on the jets midway in the race. By this time, he had separated himself by at least 5 yards on Gilbert. He ran a 9.1, a world record. The record lasted until 1974. He ran a speed of 26 miles per hour. He wasn't just named the best athlete in the world for the second time in 2 years by Track and Field. He was also named to the Florida Track and Field Hall of Fame before he even ran one race in Tokyo. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This attack unleashed an all-out war around the world, causing World War II.
A date which will live in infamy.
Japan's cities and regions were devastated. One of those cities was Tokyo. Japan spent the next 20 years not just rebuilding its infrastructure, but also its reputation. And what better way to do this than to host the most spectacular event in the world? Hayes was the most influential American Olympian coming into the Tokyo Games. Hayes won 53 races in a row. He broke records in almost every sprint category.
Bob Hayes equals the meet record set in 1958. When Mr. Hayes gets going, the X-15 couldn't catch him.
Hayes was dealing with an injury that he thought was going to keep him from participating in the Olympic tryouts. He gained 10 pounds because he was inactive. The fastest man in the world was mortal after all. All of Hayes' accomplishments hung in the balance. The sweat and the turmoil would have all been for nothing. Hayes had to successfully compete if he was going to join the Olympic team. If that wasn't enough pressure, he even got stuck in the elevator for 9 minutes on his way to catch a ride to the Coliseum. Hayes had to literally climb out of the elevator. Once he made it to the street, his ride was gone. He had to jog all the way to the Coliseum, almost getting hit by a car. But ironically, this was a blessing in disguise. In jogging, he was able to relax his legs muscles. Hayes finally made it to the most important race of his life.
The huge Coliseum in Los Angeles, built for the 32 Olympics, witnesses the finals for picking the men who will compete in the 64 game.
The match finally began. Slow off his track, Hayes had a strategic plan this time. Unlike in previous years, he held back on his speed until he hit 40 yards.
The 100-meter dash features Bob Hayes, out of competition since June owing to a pulled muscle.
Once he hit that point, it was his time to shine.
The first 3 finishers will make the trip to Tokyo for Uncle Sam. The 4th finisher makes the relay team. Hayes, world's fastest human, wins in 10-1, equaling the American record.
Bob Hayes crossed the finish line in 10.1 seconds, just a tenth of a second away from breaking the world record. Amazing. An injured Hayes ran a 10.1. He went on and won his final Olympic trial and was finally selected to represent his country in Tokyo.
The moment has finally arrived, the moment we have been waiting for here in Tokyo.
Tokyo was spectacular. This was a political success for Japan that was supposed to change the world's perception of them since World War II. But it was a pigeon-toed boy from the ghettos of Jacksonville who was about to mystify the nations. Hayes had to run 4 races in the 100 meters, 3 preliminary rounds, and the finals. The first 2 rounds was on a rainy Wednesday. As Hayes prepared his stance, it all went quiet. This is what it was all about. Why he jogged in the rain, why he raced the neighborhood kids for bragging rights. Everything in his athletic life so far prepared him for this moment right here. His first race in the rain, Hayes ran a 10.4. That was easy work. Wednesday later on, he was even better. He ran a 10.3. The next day on Thursday, Hayes was about to move from legendary to iconic speed. Speed that no one had ever seen before in the history of the modern world.
At least 75,000 quietly enthusiastic fans. I'll tell you, wearing shoes in the 1964 Olympics. He's gonna win.
Hayes ran a staggering 9.9, beating the world record at the time set by Harry Jerome. That was until the time was considered a result of a tailwind that was 12 miles per hour.
The wind was too brisk in the semifinal, and a world's record Hayes set was disallowed.
That was the second time he had run a 9.9 tailwind in his track career. The finals had finally arrived. Hayes had captivated 76,000 people's imaginations. No one had ran this fast in any coliseum in all of the world, even with a tailwind. This was his last chance to cement himself in history. His days running on the dirt tracks of Matthew Gilbert meant more than anything. You see, because Hayes ran a 9.9 early in the day, he had the best time, which means that he was qualified to pick his own lane. At least that's what traditionally happened. For the first time in Olympic history, that wasn't allowed to happen for some unknown reason. So they gave him a choppy lane. A lane that was chopped up to bits. Hayes protested for about 10 minutes, but the officials screwed him over. This turned Hayes into a beast. This time with no win, no excuses. He lined up in a lane that wasn't fit to be ran from, wearing one legitimate shoe that fit well. Once the mark hit, he took off like lightning and ran 25 yards in a flash. By the time Hayes ran for another 25 yards, he was now in his full stride, going past everybody. While everyone already hit their full speed, Hayes had a third gear that only a handful of people in track possessed. For the next 25 yards, Hayes went into supersonic mode.
It's the American R.L. Hayes all the way. He wins in 10 seconds.
And without the aiding of the wind and starting from rubble grounds, wearing borrowed shoes, he ran a 10 flat, tying the world record in the 100 meters.
A new Olympic record and equaling the world record.
It was the fastest he's ever ran unaided by the wind. Hayes wasn't finished, not yet. He participated in the 4x100 meter relay 6 days later. Now brace yourself, because Hayes is now in iconic mode. Iconic is a mode that only icons have the privilege of entering. It's a place of myth and legend. Michael Jordan entered this mode in Boston back in the 80s.
With an all-time record 63 points in a single playoff game.
Wilt Chamberlain was here when he scored 100 points in the 60s. Kobe activated it with his 81 points.
81-point game, 55 in the second half.
So did Brady.
He's in! Patriots win the Super Bowl!
And Ali.
I must be the greatest. I took up the world.
Usain Bolt activated as well.
9.58.
Hayes in his last 2 races ran 2 of the fastest times a man has ever run, and he did it in one day.
It's the American R.L. Hayes all the way.
6 days later, he was even faster. Hayes' teammates Mel Pender and Trent Jackson had been injured and had to be replaced by substitutes prior to the race.
The Olympic torch is about to be extinguished in a blaze of glory by the U.S. track team. In the 400-meter relay, the American quartet is off to a flying start.
By the time the baton was passed to Hayes for the anchor leg, Hayes found himself trailing half the field. The same kid who beat a 12th grader in the 9th grade. The same kid who went around neighborhoods and high schools humiliating the fastest guys he could run against. This is the same Hayes who ran on broken up cinder tracks and yet still tied the world record in the 100-meter. Hayes was ready for all the smoke. This was one more added jewel to his collection of bragging rights. But come on, this was Hayes. Bullet Bob Hayes.
And watch that man take off. Hayes, left, literally flies down the track as he heads for the wire to make it 39 seconds flat for the U.S. Hayes and company contribute brilliantly to the U.S. gold medal total of 36.
My gosh, he was fast. Hayes stormed back past the rest of the competition to win gold. It was the fastest anchor leg in the history of the world. I find it interesting that we really don't know how fast Hayes was. When he ran a 10.4 and a 10.3 in his first two races in Tokyo, he was cruising in the rain. When he had to run on beat up cinder tracks, he picked up his speed and tied the world record. And when he was trailing a half a field during the 4x100, he went into supersonic mode and ran the fastest anchor leg in history. It seems like Hayes ran as fast as he needed to run. I'm not certain if we will ever know how fast he truly could have been had he stayed in track. What people don't understand, Hayes could have run a much faster time than what he ran. I'm not even including the cinder tracks or the borrowed spikes.
He flies down the track as he heads for the wire to make it 39 seconds flat for the U.S.
I want to show you something about Hayes' 100-meter finals. Watch what he does 10 meters away from crossing the lane. You see it? Do you see it? He pulls up 10 meters away. He literally slowed down on a 10-second 100 world record. That's 10 yards of makeup speed. Just think about this for a second. An elite sprinter can run a meter in 2 yards. Now think how fast that can be if a player is already running as fast as Hayes did that day. Had he continued his acceleration during those 10 meters, Hayes could have easily either tied or shattered Usain Bolt's world record. Now, if we include a modern clean track and Hayes having his own shoes, we're talking about a record that no one comes close to. But here's what no one ever talks about, and it's a dagger. After Hayes' 100-meter finals, he was able to get back his shoes 6 days later. That's when he put together the fastest anchor leg in history. In that race, while wearing his own shoes, he was visibly faster than any time during the Olympics. Just imagine if he had shoes that day. After the Olympics, Hayes was the most famous Olympian in the world. Bob Hayes stunned the track world when he decided to retire and enter the NFL draft, where he would dominate the sport for 7 years. Hayes is still the first athlete to win both the gold medal and a Super Bowl. Hayes came into the Olympics as the fastest human at the Olympics, and he left the Olympics as the fastest human ever. Until next time, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and as always, thanks for watching.